Hello, my name is Mauro Zappaterra. I'm a physician practicing in Pasadena, California. I did my PhD dissertation on the cerebrospinal fluid. This is a fluid that I'd like to talk to you about today, and it's very important in connection with water. If you're interested in some of these topics, you can follow me on Instagram at Dr. Zappaterra or on my website, holdingspace.com. As a physician, I work a lot with the human body. And as we know, the human body is approximately 55 to 65% made up of water. So the majority of the composition of the human body is actually water. The cerebrospinal fluid is a very specific fluid in the human body, and its composition is 99% water. So when we're thinking about the human body and we're thinking about the fluids of the human body and the fluids that are most similar to water, we have to bring into this conversation the cerebrospinal fluid and be aware of some of its known functions as well as some of its potential functions. So what is the cerebrospinal fluid and where is it located? Well, we all have cerebrospinal fluid, and it's located in these cavities or ventricles inside our brain. We have two lateral ventricles on either side of the brain. We have a third ventricle that is right in the middle. We have a fourth ventricle. We also have a hollow tube that goes all the way down the center of our spinal cord. In our spinal cord, there's a hollow tube. That's all filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So in these cavities, in these ventricles within our brain, and in this hollow tube of our spinal cord is all filled with this beautiful fluid. 99% water. I call it the crystalline matrix. It also surrounds the outside of the brain. It surrounds the outside of the spinal cord, and it goes all the way down to the sacrum. So imagine that our entire central nervous system is actually floating and buoyant in this incredible fluid that we have in our bodies. We all have cerebrospinal fluid. At any one point in time, we have about 150 milliliters of this fluid in our body. And every day we make approximately half a liter of fluid, anywhere between 450 to 600 milliliters of fluid that we continuously produce every single day. So the fluid absorbs back into our system and we produce more. There's a beautiful balance of increasing the amount of fluid and decreasing the amount of fluid. What does this fluid do? The fluid has many functions that we understand of it today. It has the ability to transport nutrients and hormones to the central nervous system. It can regulate circadian rhythms and help us sleep or wake up. It can help regulate appetite. It can provide guiding cues for stem cells as they migrate in the brain. It can actually instruct stem cells to proliferate, to make more cells or differentiate, become a different type of cell. It creates an ionic balance, providing essential ions such as sodium, potassium, chloride to the brain. It helps eliminate waste and supports and protects the central nervous system as this buoyancy of the central nervous system that we talked about. The fascinating part about the buoyancy is that if we were to measure the weight of a human brain, it's about 1,500 grams or so. In our body right now, because of the buoyancy of the cerebrospinal fluid, our brain weighs about 25 to 50 grams. It's quite amazing when you think about it. Where did this fluid come from developmentally? Well, fascinatingly, it actually came from the amniotic fluid. The amniotic fluid is a fluid that is present in our mother's womb, in the embryo, in the mother's womb. What happens early on in development is that we are a sheet of cells. On one side of that sheet of cells, there's fluid called the amniotic fluid. As we undergo development and we start to form into the body that we have today, we undergo a process called neurulation, where we invaginate, there's an invagination that occurs, and a folding in. That actually separates the fluid on the inside of this invagination and folding in, sort of making a donut, from the fluid on the outside. The fluid on the inside of this donut then becomes the cerebrospinal fluid. The fluid on the outside remains the amniotic fluid. So while you're developing as an embryo, you are constantly being bathed in this fluid that is approximately 99% water. Where did this come from? How did the cerebrospinal fluid evolve evolutionarily? Well, this is a fascinating part of research that's undergoing right now. What they see is that the neurons in our nervous system that actually contact the cerebrospinal fluid are very similar to the neurons that are present in things like starfish and invertebrates that are found in the ocean, for instance. And those same nerve cells are actually responsible for monitoring the environment of the ocean. As development occurred and the body plan of, let's say, a starfish evolved, the body plan closed and became, for instance, like a sea worm. Now the sea worm has an internal fluid environment and an external fluid environment. The external fluid environment being seawater, the internal fluid environment also being seawater. Evolutionarily, in us, the same neurons that are making contact with the cerebrospinal fluid are similar to the neurons that are actually making contact with seawater in invertebrates. So one of the things I like to say is that our ancestral CSF is actually seawater, as the neurons evolutionarily that were making contact with the seawater are the similar neurons in us that are actually making contact with the cerebrospinal fluid, our internal seawater environment. So, why am I talking about the cerebrospinal fluid? Well, first of all, it's 99% water. And we know from a molecular biological perspective that CSF can transmit information. It can transmit things like growth factors, ions, nutrients, hormones to the developing brain and the adult brain. But it's also water. As water, we know that water can receive energy, it can store energy, and it can transmit energy. Water has the power to be able to transmit sound waves. It has the power to transmit light. It has the power to transmit electricity. It has the power to transmit vibrations and energy. And so therefore, one of my hypotheses in terms of the cerebrospinal fluid is that the CSF is a conveyor or conduit for cosmic consciousness to our physical bodies. And when I say CSF, because CSF is 99% water, what I'm essentially saying is that cosmic consciousness could actually be transmitted to our physical bodies through the water element in our body. The cerebrospinal fluid, being the most water-like, would be the fluid that receives this information first. It's a less dense fluid, let's say, than any other fluid in the human body. And so therefore, the cerebrospinal fluid could actually be this conveyor of cosmic consciousness, of source energy to our physical bodies, essentially being a bridge from the infinite to the finite. I spoke previously about the locations of this fluid in the body. One important location is the third ventricle. The third ventricle is a midline space. If you were to draw a line from your ears to midline, almost at the area of your brow center, for instance, and go in right in the middle, that is your third ventricle. In the back of your third ventricle is the pineal gland. The pineal gland is important for things like melatonin release. There's also the pituitary gland in front. There's the hypothalamus and the thalamus on the sides of this third ventricle. The third ventricle is a very interesting space. It has been called the Cave of Brahman in some traditions, or the Crystal Palace. It is, in my opinion, the third ventricle where there is an all-chemical reaction that occurs within the fluid and in conjunction and in relationship with these brain structures that allows us to have a synchronized and unified experience of the source energy, of of cosmic consciousness, and experience our true essence. So therefore, how can this actually be done? Well, the first way that this can be done is bringing awareness to your cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid that is 99% water. The other is to connect with the fluid system, the water within your body, the fluid body. And see, because what we understand, although I speak of the cerebrospinal fluid as being in these ventricles, what we know now is that the cerebrospinal fluid, when we sleep, actually goes into the brain itself. So there's movement into the tissues. And so it's very difficult to differentiate, for instance, oh, where does the cerebrospinal fluid begin and where does it end, for instance? And so what I see it as is this fluid that is housed in these ventricles that then shares the space with the tissues of the central nervous system and ultimately with the tissues of the body. So what else do we know about the cerebrospinal fluid? Well, we know that it actually can move. And many people ask me, how does the cerebrospinal fluid move? Can we activate it in any way? And we absolutely can. So we know from research that the cerebrospinal fluid moves when we sleep. When we sleep, there is an opening of the brain tissue itself that allows the cerebrospinal fluid to flow into the brain tissue. And what they believe is that the cerebrospinal fluid is cleaning up any debris or waste that builds up in the brain tissue throughout the day. Incredible mechanism of waste removal. My hypothesis is that if it happens when we sleep, then it probably happens also in other parasympathetic activities as well, such as meditation or craniosacral therapy or massage therapy or anything that puts us into a parasympathetic state. That research hasn't been done yet. Other things that we know that actually move the CSF are things like heart rate. But the one that I'm most excited about actually is the breath. We now know from research that inspiration, forced inspiration, causes the cerebrospinal fluid to move up towards the head. Expiration, when we breathe out from about mid-thoracic level down, actually causes the cerebrospinal fluid to go down. So if you breathe forced inspiration, the research has shown over 2.5 seconds actually causes the fluid to come up. Forced expiration from about mid-thoracic level causes the fluid to go down. And so imagine with any type of breath work that you do, or that you may do, the Wim Hof method, holotropic breath work, pranayama breathing, where you're doing this forced inspiration and expiration, where you're actually creating a pump, an undulating vibrations in the cerebrospinal fluid itself, in the middle of your spine. And they've actually shown that on forced inspiration, there's actually a beam, a shot of cerebrospinal fluid into your third ventricle. So as you inspire, imagine that this fluid that's bathing your whole spine comes up and it bathes your third ventricle. And as you do that, imagine this fluid being a conduit, a connection, a bridge to the infinite, to the cosmic consciousness, to source energy. And that you are actually able to modulate, to change the frequency of this fluid as you're breathing in and breathing out. One of the meditations that I recommend is breathing in and visualizing as if the fluid is actually coming into your brain, into your third ventricle. Breathing out, creating a pump. The pump is the fluid going down into your sacrum, pulling the energy up from your sacrum. And as you breathe out, the energy goes down into your sacrum, pulls it up. And then as you breathe in, it brings the energy all the way from your sacrum to your third eye, to your third ventricle. As you're doing that on the breathing in, you can also do a small little Kegel where you constrict your perineal floor, almost as if you're sort of nudging the fluid to go up into your spine, to go up through your spine into your third ventricle. So imagine, since the cerebrospinal fluid is 99% water, that things like movement, dance, belly dancing, exercise, yoga, vibrations, any type of vibrations coming from light or sound, healing Tibetan bowls, crystal bowls, whatever it might be, music, the heartbeat, how you sleep, and your breath work are all actually affecting the frequency and the vibration of this fluid, which is right in the middle of our brain, right in the middle of our spinal cord, goes all the way down to the sacrum, bathes the outside of the brain, that we can actually affect the frequency and vibration of this fluid. Imagine, therefore, that you get the fluid undulating or vibrating at a certain frequency. And that frequency actually transmits the energy of source or of cosmic consciousness through the water molecules, through this fluid to your central nervous system, but throughout your entire body. And because it's a fluid, you can have a unified experience. It can be totally synchronized. And you feel connection to everything. Besides the hypothesis of altering the vibrations and the frequency of this fluid, there's also a hypothesis, because the cerebrospinal fluid is 99% water, that maybe the cerebrospinal fluid may actually form what Dr. Pollack has described as the fourth phase of water. If you're not familiar with the fourth phase of water, it's a phase that water can become when there is a certain input of energy. That water can form a lattice. It forms a very structured lattice that essentially can create almost like a battery. It can actually transmit electrical information. So imagine that the cerebrospinal fluid pulsates or vibrates or gets energy at a certain frequency. And the cerebrospinal fluid itself becomes this lattice, transmutates into this fourth phase of water. And through this fourth phase of water, we can actually become internal energy sources, internal batteries that can not only receive information from source energy, but can then transmit information from source energy and cosmic consciousness. So, just bring your awareness to the cerebrospinal fluid. Bring your awareness to the water, the fluid nature of this fluid that is present in the middle of your brain, bathing the outside of your brain, goes all the way down to your sacrum, and in the hollow cavity in your spinal canal. Simply bring awareness to it. Bring awareness to the fluid that's bathing your third ventricle right now. Notice if there's any relationship with it. Connect with the fluid nature of the cerebrospinal fluid, but also know that the cerebrospinal fluid doesn't end in the cavities, that it goes throughout your entire central nervous system, that it goes throughout your entire body, that the water component of it goes throughout your entire body. Connect with that. Notice what happens. Is there an expansion of your energy field? Is there a connection with a greater energy source? Is there an awareness of that connection? Because the connection is always there. Is there a felt sense of that connection? Is there a felt sense of your beingness? Is there a felt sense of the I am? And then through the fluid, going prior to I am.